Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 19, Section 3, the New Deal Coalition. So let's get started here. We have a main idea. Franklin Roosevelt was easily reelected in 1936, but the New Deal lost momentum during the second term due to his court-packing plan and a new recession. So in number one, support for the New Deal came from primarily a coalition that included farmers, industrial workers, African Americans, new immigrants, ethnic minorities, women, progressives, and intellectuals. And among those people who were not necessarily too happy with what FDR was doing were the Republicans. They actually nominated Alfred Landon, who was the governor of Kansas, to oppose Roosevelt in 1936. Needless to say, Landon, for the most part, did not necessarily gain the momentum that he needed to take on Roosevelt, and obviously Roosevelt's going to be reelected. So, after winning this reelection, Roosevelt tried to change the political balance of the Supreme Court through what is known as the court packing plan. The court packing plan really kind of goes back to the Schechter case, if you remember hearing about that in Section 2. And to kind of get his revenge with the Supreme Court, he basically offered a proposal, and that would be that any justice over the age of 70 would have to retire, and then he would have the ability to appoint new justices because, one of the things that a president gets to do is they get to nominate people for the Supreme Court, and he would nominate individuals who would, for the most part, back up his New Deal policies. And as interesting as this idea is, he was going to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court up to 15. Presently, there are only 9 justices. And certainly there were Democrats that even were concerned about what Roosevelt was proposing. There's a little saying, a stitch in time saves 9. And for the most part, because there were people that were upset with what Roosevelt was trying to do because it was purely based on revenge for what happened in the Schechter case, the Supreme Court is untouched. And we still currently have 9 justices. But certainly the Supreme Court has to be something that is kind of not politically based, and that's the beauty of it. Our justices, they don't campaign for office. They typically don't put out endorsements for candidates, and part of that is so that they can kind of have that neutrality that makes it possible for them to do their job and to do it in a way that is kind of unbiased. So number 4, economist John Maynard Keynes, who you see pictured here to the right. He argued that the government should spend heavily in a recession, even if it requires for this idea of deficit spending. Keynes is a British citizen, but he certainly had a huge influence on the American economy. One of the things that is going to happen during this time is that Roosevelt is going to do some deficit spending as a way to kind of pull the economy out of this depression. Now, is the depression going to be ended solely because of deficit spending? Absolutely not. It's going to take a world war to make that happen, to end this depression. But what's interesting is Keynes's ideas are going to be employed in the 1980s when we talk about guys like Ronald Reagan, this idea of spending heavily to kind of spur economic growth. Needless to say, it does have its side effects, and that is that you have a huge deficit that at some point in time, you really want the nation to take a hold of. So, in your next main idea, the New Deal expanded federal power over the economy and established a social safety net. And one of those things was the Farm Security Administration. The Farm Security Administration gave loans to tenant farmers or people who were, for the most part, renting land so that they could purchase farms. Some of the farms that were made available were not necessarily the most productive lands. I know firsthand that I have relatives in Iowa that ended up receiving some land under the Farm Security Administration because they were tenant farmers up to that point. But the land itself was not necessarily land that was known for yielding bumper crops or anything like that. Another thing that kind of expanded the power was this idea of the Fair Labor Standard Act. This act, for the most part, was passed in 1938. And one of the things that it was kind of known for is the abolition of child labor. So basically, it said that children who were under the age of 18 cannot do dangerous work, and kids who were under the age of 16 could not work in factories or manufacturing or mining, and that these young people could not work during school hours. So for the most part, it pretty much kicked kids out of the workforce. And that was good because that meant that there would be more jobs available to adults. Okay. It also set the first federal minimum wage. That came in at roughly 25 cents. The idea was that starting in roughly 1938, it would be about 25 cents. And then within 7 years, it would be bumped up to roughly 40 cents an hour. Okay. It also established an 8-hour workday. It established a 40-hour work week, which are some of the things that, if you remember back to the populists, that they were crying for, okay, at the turn of the century. It also set up this idea that if you work over 40 hours a week, that you should be given time and a half, and that is like the amount of time and a half multiplied by your regular wage that would, for the most part, turn out to be your overtime wage that you would receive. One thing that should be noted is that the Fair Labor Standard Act did not apply to people who were seasonal workers. So if you were only employed for a part of the year, you were not necessarily covered by this. It didn't also cover people who were involved in jobs where tipping was kind of a way to make wages. So if you were like, let's say, a busboy or a waitress or a waiter, that would not necessarily be covered by this act. Eventually, there are going to be some acts that are going to apply to that, but it's going to be outside of the 1930s. You're going to have to really kind of work your way into the 50s and the 60s to see that happening. And number 7, as Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats began blocking New Deal legislation, Roosevelt became increasingly preoccupied with the growing threats posed by Germany and Japan. And it's going to be these threats that are eventually going to help pull us out of this economic rut. When we start having to rebuild our military and to basically establish a draft, that's going to help our economy eventually put more people to work. And number 8, as a whole, the New Deal tended to operate so that it balanced competing economic interest. In number 9, in 1937, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had a constitutional authority under the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate production within a state. This is kind of interesting because this is kind of at the heart of what was an issue with the Schechter case. And eventually there's going to be some things that are going to be tweaked here that are going to allow the ICC to kind of have a little more say and power and authority. But some of that had to go back to Congress and had to be written up into law before it could actually be interpreted by the Constitution or by the court. And number 10, by the end of the 1930s, the American people felt that the government had a duty to maintain, here we go, maybe, to maintain a safety net economically for its citizens. Okay. But again, what's really going to help our nation, probably more than anything, is this idea that we have to be prepared to fight a war. You might take a look at this political cartoon to the right here. Basically, the snake is fascism, and Roosevelt's program to make the president supreme in the US. Some people thought that that kind of tied in with some of the things that were happening elsewhere in the world when we talk about fascist dictators. So certainly FDR had his critics. Thank you very much.